last entry in Dr. Silas Crampton's leather journal, dated November 15, 1887, contained just 7 chilling words. Subject 247 screamed for 6 straight hours. When Kentucky officials forced open the sealed doors of the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum 3 weeks later, they uncovered something that scarred them forever. More than 214 men had disappeared from nearby counties over a year and a half, all declared insane by the same well-regarded alienist. Behind the asylum, in a shallow mass grave, they found double that number. For nearly a century and a half, Kentucky kept those records hidden, buried even deeper than the victims. Before diving further into the twisted tale of Dr. Crampton and the nightmare that unfolded in Frankfurt, make sure you're subscribed and let us know in the comments what state you're tuning in from, because the horrors that unfolded in Kentucky could have easily happened anywhere in America. What made the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum truly terrifying wasn't just the screams echoing in the night, but the quiet heartbreak of families searching desperately for loved ones who would never return. In 1886, Frankfurt stood as Kentucky's proud capital home to nearly 8,000 people along the winding banks of the Kentucky River. Its limestone government buildings rose like monuments to progress, while steamboats pushed tobacco and bourbon northward. But beneath that facade of prosperity, the state still wrestled with Civil War scars and the growing pains of Reconstruction. The asylum itself opened in 1874, a towering 3-story Kirkbride-style structure, its long wings radiating from a central building like the spokes of a wheel. Its domed cupola and manicured grounds suggested progress and compassion, far from the shackles and cages of earlier days when Dr. Crampton assumed control in 1884. He arrived with glowing credentials from Pennsylvania and a reputation for brilliance. Tall, lean, prematurely gray, with piercing eyes that missed nothing, he cut a commanding figure. His every move was exact, almost mechanical, and his ever-present journal captured endless notes in a cramped hand. To Kentucky's leaders, he promised that insanity was not a curse, but a puzzle solvable through science. His writings boasted of cures that could restore even the most broken minds. Governor James Proctor, eager to modernize state institutions, gave him near total authority over the asylum's operations and budget. Working beside him was head nurse Hannah Rutledge, a stern woman whose starched white uniform and cold blue eyes commanded obedience and fear in equal measure. Patients learned quickly to dread the sound of her steps in the corridor. By early 1886, the asylum held just over 100 patients. Men and women sent by families who couldn't cope, vagrants swept up by sheriffs and veterans whose minds had shattered on the battlefield. Most came from Kentucky's rural backroads places where medicine was scarce and superstition still shaped daily life. Dr. Crampton's ambitions reached far beyond caring for the truly ill. By 1886, he was in close contact with pharmaceutical firms in Boston and New York, promising to test experimental compounds that, if successful, could redefine the treatment of mental illness and generate fortunes for whoever controlled the cure. But his plans required one essential ingredient: a steady supply of human subjects. Kentucky's isolated rural counties, where poor men could vanish without anyone powerful noticing, became his hunting ground. The first cracks in his scheme appeared that spring, when families in Breathitt County began reporting disappearances. Samuel Hutchins, a 42-year-old blacksmith, traveled to Frankfurt to sell horseshoes, only for his wife Mary to be told days later that he had been committed for violent mania and had died suddenly of apoplexy. Hardy Peaton, a farmer from Cumberland County, vanished during a routine trip to deliver corn. His family later informed that he too had been admitted to the asylum and died of advanced dementia within days. By the fall, the pattern was unmistakable. Dozens of men from the poorest counties were disappearing, all declared insane by Crampton or his associates, all dead shortly after arriving at the asylum. Yet the political establishment looked the other way, their silence purchased through regular donations funneled into Governor Knott's campaign coffers from accounts controlled by the asylum. On October 13, 1886, Crampton escalated his work under what records would later describe as the Accelerated Treatment Protocol. A cold rain beat against the asylum's tall windows as 23 new patients arrived, committed on petty charges of vagrancy or disturbance. Among them was Thomas Caldwell, a 34-year-old carpenter from Wolfe County, whose only crime had been striking a salesman who insulted his sister. His wife Sarah pleaded desperately for his release, offering to pay fines or restitution. But her voice was ignored as the asylum wagon carried him away. Inside the Stark receiving room, head nurse Hannah Rutledge recorded names and symptoms in a thick ledger while her assistant stripped the men of their belongings and issued coarse gray uniforms. Crampton watched from his desk, surrounded by glass vials and instruments, making notes in his journal as if cataloging specimens. When his eyes settled on Caldwell, he paused, murmuring to Rutledge's strong constitution, good muscle tone, clear eyes. This one shows promise for advanced trials. The words chilled Thomas, though he could not yet grasp their full meaning. Soon the new arrivals were divided and led away. Some to ordinary wards, others to a wing sealed off from the rest of the institution. Its windows were blackened, its doors barred. Within the asylum no longer resembled a hospital, but a laboratory of cruelty. Iron tables lined the chambers where men were strapped down, while Crampton tested compounds provided by Pemberton Pharmaceuticals of Boston. He called it cerebral stimulation direct injections into the bloodstream. The results were horrific. Some patients convulsed violently, their screams echoing down the halls. Others fell into such a deep stupor they appeared lifeless, their faint breathing detectable only by the closest inspection. In this hidden wing, the line between science and torture had not blurred, it had vanished entirely. Thomas Caldwell received his first injection on October 16th. The yellow liquid seared through his veins like molten fire, his body writhing against the restraints as the world fractured into impossible colors and sounds. He screamed words in languages he didn't know, his limbs twisting into shapes that seemed to mock human anatomy. Through the haze, he saw Dr. Crampton calmly recording every detail, his pocket watch ticking steadily as he measured each stage of suffering. This was only the beginning. The doctor's so-called graduated exposure protocol meant that every night brought a new concoction, stronger, stranger, deadlier. Men who endured the first rounds were subjected to cocktails of chemicals that left them blind, paralyzed, or trapped in a waking coma. Most didn't survive long. Those who died were whisked away in silence, replaced almost immediately by new arrivals carted in from across Kentucky. Hannah Rutledge became indispensable to these trials. Her medical training allowed her to keep men alive just long enough for Crampton to finish his observations. She used crude electrical devices to jolt failing hearts back into rhythm, reviving subjects only to plunge them once more into torment. Unlike her employer, whose obsession was framed as science, Rutledge seemed to relish her role. Power over life and death was a thrill she carried in her cold blue stare. But such work demanded secrecy. Families who came searching for missing husbands, sons, or brothers were handed forged death certificates and guided to a cemetery where empty graves bore familiar names. Visitors who questioned too much risked their own freedom, declared unstable by Crampton after brief examinations designed less to test their sanity than to silence them. The machine of deception and cruelty ran smoothly through the winter of 1886 and into the next year. By the summer of 1887, over 200 men had vanished into the asylum's hidden wing, their existence erased as if they had never walked the earth. Yet the doctor's ambitions only swelled. The experimental wing grew month by month, consuming nearly half the asylum's space. Genuine patients were crammed into smaller, neglected quarters, while resources, staff, and funds poured into Crampton's experiments. His once organized leather journal had multiplied into 7 volumes, its entries increasingly frantic. The pages overflowed with sketches of contorted faces, precise timelines of neurological collapse, and careful calculations of how much poison a man could endure before his body failed. Rutledge, expanding the staff, sought out those least likely to question orders: former Confederate soldiers hardened by war and recent immigrants desperate for steady work. Among them was Wilhelm Brennan, a young German who had arrived in Kentucky only months earlier hoping for coal mine work. Instead, he found himself in the doctor's service, tasked with maintaining equipment and disposing of what Crampton no longer needed. That phrase covered everything from stained uniforms to human remains. As the death's mounted disposal became a grim daily routine, and Wilhelm soon realized he had traded one kind of darkness for another, far more terrifying. At first, Crampton used the asylum's official cemetery as cover, forging records to justify the shocking death toll. But as the numbers swelled far beyond anything remotely believable, he was forced into darker solutions. Wilhelm soon discovered that the limestone caves beneath Frankfurt offered ideal hiding places. Corpses could be dropped into bottomless crevices or submerged in the acidic pools that ate away flesh and bone until nothing remained. Yet the doctor's most lucrative scheme reached far beyond Kentucky. He struck quiet deals with medical schools in the Northeast, supplying them with fresh cadavers for dissection. Preserved in ice during the winter and shipped north in sealed coffins labeled as asylum patients, the bodies raised no suspicion. Institutions like Harvard, under the guidance of Dr. Marcus Wainwright, funneled payments through shell companies scattered across state lines, ensuring no paper trail could ever lead back to the asylum. A single corpse fetched up to $200 more than a Kentucky farmer earned in a year, and Crampton was shipping dozens. Through all of this, Thomas Caldwell endured. His strength allowed him to survive where others perished, making him one of Crampton's prized subjects. By July 1887, his body had become a canvas for the doctor's long-term trials, enduring injection after injection until his mind began to splinter. Sometimes he drifted into hallucinations, lost in waves of chemical delirium. At other times, he regained clarity long enough to piece together the brutal machinery around him. He learned the rhythms of the place, the cries of men under the needle, the abrupt silences that marked death, and the grinding sounds of Wilhelm's nightly labors as bodies were prepared for disposal. But Thomas wasn't the only one watching. Beyond the asylum's walls, cracks in Crampton's empire were beginning to form. Sarah Caldwell, unwilling to accept the story of her husband's sudden madness and death, began organizing meetings in Wolfe County. She gathered women whose men had vanished after being swept up by asylum magistrates, and soon similar groups were forming in Breathitt, Leslie, and Cumberland counties. As they compared stories, chilling patterns emerged. Healthy men sent to Frankfurt, quick commitments, and sudden deaths explained away with convenient causes like apoplexy or general debility. When the families appealed to the state, they received nothing but polite form letters offering sympathy and death certificates bearing Crampton's unmistakable signature. The few who traveled to Frankfurt to demand answers faced an even harsher reality. Armed guards turned them away at the gates, insisting their sons and husbands were too violent for visitation. For the women left standing on the muddy roads outside the asylum, it was a warning as clear as it was cruel. The men inside no longer belonged to them. Some visitors were allowed brief meetings with men they were told were their relatives, but the drugged figures they encountered were strangers. When wives and mothers protested, officials coldly explained that insanity often altered appearance so drastically that recognition was impossible. By late summer of 1887, this web of grieving families had grown into something more dangerous for Crampton, an informal investigation. Sarah Caldwell had reached out to editors in Lexington and Louisville, and her careful documentation of Asylum irregularities landed on the desks of journalists at the Courier-Journal. A reporter had already begun probing the Asylum's staggering death rate, and his early findings raised questions that even Crampton's political connections could not easily bury. The doctor sensed his empire was close to collapse. His careful machinery of secrecy was straining under public scrutiny, and Governor Knott's protection might not survive a scandal of this magnitude. Something had to be done, and Hannah Rutledge wasted no time devising solutions that would soon extend beyond the asylum's iron gates. That autumn, a chill swept Kentucky, a season colder than memory, as if nature recoiled from what was happening behind those brick walls. Crampton's experiments had swelled into something almost industrial in scale. New patients arrived by the wagon load, funneled through corrupt magistrates and pliant judges who committed men for debts, drunkenness, or the smallest social offense. Each commitment was greased with bribes from the asylum's funds, and each provided new fuel for the doctor's research. Rutledge even kept a standing order, 20 fresh subjects each week sorted by physical condition. Young, healthy men were reserved for the military-style trials, while older or frailer subjects were funneled into the toxicity experiments that few survived. Women too risky to disappear quietly were largely avoided. Wilhelm Brennan's role expanded with this growth. No longer just a janitor of horrors, he had become Crampton's indispensable technician. He preserved organs for shipment to northern medical schools, built specialized equipment for ever more grotesque experiments, and under Rutledge's direction, took on external operations tasks outside the asylum when trouble needed to be silenced. The first came in September 1887, after Sarah Caldwell's evidence reached Senator Robert Fleming, who announced an unannounced inspection of the asylum. Such scrutiny would have exposed the entire charade. On September 14th, Fleming was found dead in his Frankfurt hotel, the victim doctors said of a heart attack. But the truth was more sinister. The physician who signed off on the death certificate had been paid well to overlook the signs, and Fleming's notes vanished from his room before his family could claim them. The investigation died with him. Yet, if Crampton and Rutledge thought the senator's death would end the threat, they underestimated Sarah Caldwell. Fleming's suspicious fate hardened her resolve. She began corresponding with families in Tennessee, West Virginia, and Ohio, discovering the chilling possibility that Kentucky was only one piece of a broader network. Other asylums showed the same patterns. Healthy men declared insane, quickly committed, quietly dead. If her suspicions were correct, the number of victims could stretch into the thousands. Letters in Sarah's possession hinted at coordination between Frankfurt and institutions across state lines, a conspiracy of medicine and money that dwarfed even Crampton's nightmare. Inside the asylum's sealed wing, Thomas Caldwell clung to what fragments of sanity he had left. In rare lucid hours, he scavenged scraps of charcoal and cloth, scratching down what he had seen, what he had endured. His secret record, crude and fragile, was the only testimony of the horrors still unfolding behind locked doors. Thomas Caldwell's hidden journal lay beneath the loose floorboards of his cell, a desperate archive carved from scraps of charcoal and cloth. Its pages bore sketches of the asylum's cruel machines, crude notations of the chemical brews forced into men's veins, and most damning of all, a list of names, hundreds of them, who had entered the experimental wing and never returned. He wasn't alone in his effort. Benjamin Curtis, a former schoolteacher from Montgomery County, had committed to memory everything he could not put to paper. determined that if either man escaped, the truth would follow. Together they had built a record of over 200 vanished souls. Their chance came in October of 1887, when a fire in the laundry building drew much of the staff into a frantic response. In the confusion, Thomas and Benjamin slipped from their cells, edging toward the main building with the fragile hope of reaching the outside world. But hope was short-lived. Wilhelm Brennan spotted their absence within minutes, and Hannah Rutledge's decision was swift and merciless. Rather than return them to their cells, she ordered both men transferred to the terminal ward, a place reserved for those no longer useful to Crampton's research. Here death was not an accident, but the intended outcome. Benjamin Curtis died that very night, convulsing violently as Crampton tested a new nerve agent meant for military use. Thomas survived, though barely. The trial left him partially paralyzed. His speech slurred, his limbs unreliable. Yet his mind remained clear, sharp enough to understand that his end was near. He knew he would soon join the hundreds of nameless victims buried in limestone caverns beneath Frankfurt. But beyond the walls, forces were shifting. Sarah Caldwell had connected with a federal investigator who specialized in medical fraud, and her tireless letters had carried the asylum's secrets to Washington. For the first time, the web of corruption shielding Crampton began to fray. By November, the first frost glazed the asylum grounds, sealing the earth in icy silence, while horrors festered beneath. Inside, Crampton unraveled. His once precise journals dissolved into ramblings, wild theories about the soul, grotesque sketches of dissected flesh, meticulous renderings of death masks drawn with obsessive detail. His authority waned, and Hannah Rutledge tightened her grip, expanding her network of complicit judges and officials to 6 counties to keep the asylum supplied with men. But even her ruthless efficiency could not stem the tide. Federal questions cut deeper than forged papers could answer, and bribed doctors could not silence the mounting suspicion. The breaking point came on November 8, 1887. Federal Marshal James Douglas arrived in Frankfurt carrying a warrant to inspect the asylum's records. Unlike state officials, he owed nothing to Crampton or Governor Knott. His authority came from Washington, and it could not be bought off or bribed away. The news of his arrival reached the asylum before Douglas himself did, carried on whispers from Rutledge's informants in the capital. For the first time since he had begun his research, Crampton faced a reckoning he could not control. Hannah Rutledge wasted no time once she learned of Marshal Douglas's approach. She activated what she chillingly called the sterilization protocol, a plan crafted for the day federal scrutiny became unavoidable. The order was simple: erase every trace of the experiments and silence every living witness. Wilhelm Brennan worked through the night of November 7th, shoving thousands of pages of records into the asylum's furnaces. Even Crampton's 7 leather-bound journals, swollen with 2 years of experiments, took hours to burn their bindings, resisting until they too turned to ash. By dawn, nearly all documentary evidence was gone. Only the living test subjects remained. There were 43 of them left. Men broken, but still breathing, each one a liability that could expose the truth. Rutledge decided they could not be hidden. Instead, they would be eliminated. Just after midnight, on November 8th, the killings began in the asylum's basement, a space retrofitted with drains in the floors, as if designed for slaughter. One by one, the men were strapped down and injected with massive doses of morphine. The drugs silenced their hearts within minutes. Rutledge oversaw every step with icy precision, her hands steady, as if she were performing routine medical rounds rather than mass execution. Thomas Caldwell, half paralyzed but still lucid, feigned unconsciousness when the guards came. From the shadows of his table, he bore witness as his fellow captives were methodically erased. He watched Benjamin Carter of Harlan County die, clutching a wooden cross, tears on his cheeks. He listened to James Mullins of Pike County whisper his wife's name until his body convulsed and went still. For Thomas, survival was agony, but it bought him time. By dawn, Rutledge turned her attention to him. Strapped to the table, he looked up into her cold blue eyes as she prepared the final syringe. The irony cut deep. After surviving months of chemical torment, he would die, not as a subject, but as a witness to secrets too dangerous to leave alive. Yet fate intervened. Before Rutledge could deliver the injection, the asylum erupted in chaos. Marshal Douglas and his team had arrived early, surrounding the grounds under cover of night. The guards scrambled, leaving the basement momentarily undefended. Summoning a last reserve of strength, Thomas ripped free from his restraints and lashed out, striking Rutledge with a metal instrument and knocking her aside. Staggering half-blind with pain, he forced himself up the stairs toward the main building. What he found there shattered even the horrors he had endured. Douglas's men had already uncovered evidence that dwarfed anything Thomas could imagine. The asylum was not an isolated nightmare, but part of a vast network. Records revealed links between Kentucky officials, pharmaceutical companies, and military interests. The systematic killing of indigent men was just one branch of a larger scheme: organ trafficking, chemical weapons testing, and a covert trade in cadavers that spanned multiple states. The most damning discovery came from Dr. Crampton's private safe. Inside, investigators found letters and contracts, carefully coded but undeniable, laying out the full scope of the conspiracy and naming every partner involved. It was a web that reached into the highest levels of Kentucky's government and spread outward to institutions across America. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum was not an aberration. It was a prototype. The letters pulled from Crampton's safe revealed a machinery of evil disguised as medicine, an operation propped up by political corruption and financed by the very institution and sworn to heal. Just when it seemed the horrors of Frankfurt had reached their peak, the nightmare deepened. If this story is chilling, you share it with a friend who lives for dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because now we uncover what happened when Thomas Caldwell, broken but unbowed, finally reached the federal investigators. Staggering through blood-slick corridors, Thomas carried the truth etched into his memory. A record of human experiments so vast, it would become one of the darkest chapters in American history. But would anyone trust the word of a man stamped insane by the very doctor he accused? Marshal James Douglas had seen corruption rot institutions from the inside, but nothing prepared him for what he found in the asylum's basement. The chamber Rutledge had converted into a slaughterhouse reeked of blood and morphine, its drains clogged with the remains of 42 men executed only hours before his arrival. When Thomas burst into the main hall, his body wrecked, but his mind aflame with testimony, Douglas understood the scale of what he faced. Guided by Thomas, investigators entered the experimental wing. What they found left no room for doubt: tables rigged with crude electrical devices to prolong suffering, shelves lined with jars of dissected organs, racks of chemical equipment designed for no treatment any sane doctor would administer. Perhaps most damning were the photographic plates, each labeled with subject numbers and experimental codes, capturing the agony of men in their final moments. Dr. Silas Crampton was discovered in his office, seated behind his desk, as though nothing had happened. He looked up at the marshal with the same cool clinical detachment that had carried him through months of slaughter. Charged with murder, fraud, and conspiracy, he offered no denial. Instead, he spoke with pride. "You cannot comprehend the magnitude of what we have accomplished here," he told Douglas, his tone devoid of remorse. "These subjects were not victims, they were pioneers. Their suffering will fuel discoveries that will change medicine and safeguard this nation. Their deaths were sacrifices, not crimes." Hannah Rutledge, however, was nowhere to be found. In the chaos of the raid, she vanished into the Kentucky night, carrying with her a cache of cash and coded documents linking the asylum to other institutions. Investigators would later confirm what Sarah Caldwell already suspected. Frankfurt was only one node in a sprawling network of covert experimentation, stretching across multiple states. Rutledge's escape exposed just how deep the rot had spread. Her network of bribed officials and hired killers had given her the kind of mobility and protection Crampton never imagined needing. In chasing her trail, Marshall Douglas's team began to piece together the full scale of the conspiracy. The evidence pointed straight to the top Governor James Proctor Knott himself. A secret account revealed more than $50,000 in payments from the Asylum funds that had fueled his campaigns and financed his lifestyle. But money wasn't the only currency. Knott had been promised access to research results data that could give Kentucky's budding pharmaceutical industry a head start in the national market. The paper trail only grew darker. Correspondence with Harvard's Dr. Marcus Wainwright showed that cadaver sales were just the surface of a much larger operation. Wainwright had been coordinating a network of physicians across the Northeast, all running parallel programs of human experimentation, sharing methods for how to extract the maximum value from unwilling subjects. The chemicals tested at the asylum had come directly from companies like Peton Pharmaceuticals, which provided dosages and instructions so specific they could only have been designed for human trials. Executives had carefully insulated themselves with layers of shell companies, but their presence was unmistakable in the documents Douglas's team recovered. Most disturbing of all were letters from military officials expressing interest in the asylum's nerve agent experiments. These weren't simply tests gone too far. They were battlefield trials in disguise. Patients had been used as living test subjects for weapons meant to kill thousands. The intersection of science, profit, and national defense had created an institution where morality no longer had a foothold. Meanwhile, Wilhelm Brennan was discovered hiding in the limestone caves, surrounded by the very evidence he had worked so hard to conceal. Confronted with the enormity of his crimes, he broke down completely, describing in detail how bodies were lowered into caverns, dissolved in acidic pools, or dumped into abandoned mine shafts. His testimony led investigators to dozens of hidden graves, and what they found there eclipsed even their darkest expectations. Hundreds of corpses lay twisted in the shadows of the caves, many bearing the unmistakable scars of experimentation. Personal belongings, wedding bands, pocket watches, family photos, had been carefully stored in waterproof containers, a grotesque archive of the lives erased in the name of progress. But the most devastating discovery came from a hidden compartment behind Crampton's office fireplace. Their investigators found his master journal. Unlike the volumes already destroyed, this one contained the complete scope of the conspiracy. It listed contacts across 12 states, all part of a coordinated shadow network of doctors, pharmaceutical magnates, and government officials. Kentucky, it turned out, was not an outlier. It was the model. The journal detailed plans to expand into other southern states, where poverty and corruption made recruitment of victims easy and oversight non-existent. The profits from cadaver sales, organ trafficking, and pharmaceutical contracts would ensure the system funded itself indefinitely. And at the center of it all stood Thomas Caldwell. Broken in body but sharp in mind, his testimony was the linchpin. His memory for names, dates, procedures, and the very sounds of the experiments brought to life, details no ledger could. He recounted how men were taken, how magistrates rubber-stamped commitments, how Hannah Rutledge and Dr. Crampton perfected the machinery of disappearance. Through Thomas's words, investigators were able to connect documentation, physical evidence, and political corruption into one undeniable truth. The conspiracy that unraveled in the wake of Thomas Caldwell's escape revealed just how methodical and profitable the machinery of death had become. In rural Kentucky, magistrates targeted men least likely to be missed. Widowers, immigrants, drifters, and those already estranged from family. With trumped-up charges and sham competency hearings, these men were declared insane and delivered to the asylum. For each commitment, a magistrate pocketed $50, deputies earned transport fees, and coroners collected bonuses for every fraudulent death certificate signed. The entire judicial framework of eastern Kentucky had been twisted into a harvesting machine, one that fed Crampton's experiments and lined the pockets of those sworn to uphold the law. Marshall Douglas's inquiry that followed was one of the most exhaustive federal investigations of the 19th century. Over 6 months, his team amassed more than 3,000 pages of testimony and evidence detailing the disappearance and murder of at least 214 men. When Dr. Silas Crampton stood trial in Louisville in the summer of 1888, the charges ranged from murder and conspiracy to fraud and violations of the emerging Food and Drug Act. Prosecutors framed him not as a visionary physician, but as a cold-blooded killer who hid slaughter behind the mask of science. The defense insisted Crampton had been authorized by state officials to conduct research, but that argument collapsed when Governor Knott's direct involvement was exposed. The trial stretched 7 weeks, with newspapers across the nation publishing lurid details of the asylum's atrocities. The testimony that riveted the courtroom came from Thomas Caldwell himself. Broken in body but unwavering in memory, he recounted his months of torture, naming names, describing methods, and giving voice to the silenced dead. Defense attorneys tried to discredit him as insane, but his testimony remained steady, precise, and impossible to dismiss. Throughout it all, Crampton sat impassive, his gray eyes betraying nothing as witness after witness described the horrors he had orchestrated. When finally offered a chance to speak before sentencing, he showed no remorse. "History will vindicate my methods," he declared to Judge Robert Boyd. "The men who died here died in service to a greater cause than their individual existence could ever have achieved." His words did nothing to sway the court. Judge Boyd condemned him to death by hanging, calling his crimes among the most monstrous ever committed on American soil. On December 15, 1888, the sentence was carried out in the courtyard of Louisville Federal Prison. Among those in attendance was Thomas Caldwell, who watched the man who had destroyed his body and stolen hundreds of lives finally pay the price. But Hannah Rutledge was never caught. Despite a decade-long manhunt, she slipped through the cracks, her trail marked by suspicious deaths at medical institutions across several states, each echoing the same patterns that had begun in Kentucky. Her survival kept alive the most chilling question of all: had the conspiracy truly been broken? Or had it simply spread, evolving in the shadows, under new names and institutions? Hannah Rutledge vanished into history, her network of allies and hidden finances giving her the means to reinvent herself under new names. Though the Kentucky investigation forced her to scale back, whispers of her presence surfaced for years, at medical institutions where sudden deaths and questionable practices mirrored her methods. She remained a phantom, never captured, her legacy echoing through the shadows of American medicine. Wilhelm Brennan, meanwhile, faced justice. By cooperating with investigators, he exchanged a death sentence for prison time, offering the government an inside account of the asylum's disposal operations. His maps of the cave systems and testimony about body handling allowed families across Kentucky to finally learn the fates of their lost sons, husbands, and fathers. He served 14 years before being deported to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1919, a broken man who had carried secrets too dark to speak aloud. The political fallout in Kentucky was seismic. Governor James Proctor Knott resigned in disgrace, his career obliterated by revelations of bribes and complicity. Legislators tied to the asylum's funds were either voted out or indicted, though many escaped punishment. Pharmaceutical companies, exposed for their role in supplying compounds for illegal testing, were dragged before Congress. Yet their influence proved too strong. Most escaped serious consequence, dissolving and rebranding under fresh names, their executives shielded by wealth and connections. Peton Pharmaceuticals quietly settled civil suits with victims' families for undisclosed sums, while Harvard distanced itself from Dr. Marcus Wainwright, declaring his involvement independent. Wainwright resigned, then disappeared, rumored to have continued his work in private labs beyond the reach of regulators. Thomas Caldwell returned home, but the scars of his ordeal never healed. Paralysis and neurological damage haunted him until his death in 1904, though his testimony had already ensured that the crimes of Frankfurt would not be forgotten. His wife Sarah became one of Kentucky's fiercest reformers. Traveling from town to town, she gave voice to the silenced warning of what unchecked power and secrecy could unleash. She lobbied for stronger oversight of state institutions, her work laying the foundation for reforms that shaped the early 20th century mental health system. The asylum itself was erased. Its brick walls were torn down, the grounds repurposed as if the state hoped to bury the memory of what had transpired there. A new facility was built in Lexington under strict oversight, a gesture toward progress. Yet beneath the reforms lay unanswered questions. Crampton's master journal hinted at a network far larger than what was exposed, stretching across multiple states. Reports trickled in from Tennessee, West Virginia, and Ohio, stories of men disappearing into institutions and never coming out. But federal investigators, restrained by politics and resources, never fully pursued them. And so the question lingered like a ghost. Was Frankfurt an isolated nightmare, or merely the first chapter in a hidden history of American medicine where science, profit, and power conspired at the expense of the forgotten? The limestone caves that once swallowed the victims of Crampton's experiments were sealed by the state officially to prevent contamination, but in truth, to keep curiosity seekers from disturbing what lay within. For years, locals whispered of strange echoes from the sealed chambers, though officials dismissed them as nothing more than geological noise. The exact number of dead will never be known. Investigators confirmed 214, but evidence suggested the machinery of murder had been running longer, with some disappearances never even reported. Beneath Frankfurt, in the silence of the caves, countless bones may still rest, an unmarked archive of one of the darkest chapters in American medicine. What unsettled investigators most was not only the scale of the atrocity, but how easily it had been made possible. Political corruption, greed, and scientific ambition had converged in a way that transformed hospitals into slaughterhouses. And these forces were not unique to Kentucky, nor to the 1880s. The same conditions, unchecked authority, institutional secrecy, and powerful industries with profit to protect, still existed elsewhere. The Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum became a cautionary tale, a reminder that when the pursuit of knowledge loses its moral compass, science can become indistinguishable from cruelty. The men who perished there did not volunteer in the name of progress. They were taken, used, and discarded by a system that valued their deaths more than their lives. Only Thomas Caldwell's courage, his testimony given at extraordinary personal cost, ensured their suffering was not erased. His words helped establish legal precedents that strengthened protections for patients across the United States. Yet even now the question lingers, are those protections enough? Or do the same ingredients that birthed Crampton's reign of terror still exist in subtler, hidden forms? The lesson is chillingly clear. Evil often cloaks itself in the language of progress. It wears the mask of science, the authority of medicine, the legitimacy of government. And unless we remain vigilant, unless oversight matches ambition, history has shown us that the vulnerable will always be at risk. What do you think? Could something like this still happen today, reshaped for a modern world, but no less sinister? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about how we can keep history's darkest lessons from repeating. If this story gripped you, hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more hidden horrors from America's past. See you in the next video.